All right, in this video, we are going to take a look at the immune system portion of our blood, which are your white blood cells and your platelets. If you remember, blood by definition is a tissue because tissues are groups of cells that work together. Well, in blood, you have erythrocytes, which are your red blood cells. You have leukocytes, which are your white blood cells, and you have these things called thrombocytes, which you commonly call your platelets. And it has a liquid matrix, and so the ground substances of this type of connective tissue would be plasma and anything that's dissolved in that plasma. Well, in the case of erythrocytes were your red blood cells, and what we're going to look at today is what I call the police department of your body, which are your leukocytes. And leukocytes are your white blood cells. And these are what are responsible for basically what you call your immune system. Most of our white blood cells are phagocytotic, which means that they are going to go around and eat or destroy anything that does not have your marker protein on it. That's what your immune system is looking for. Remember, every cell in your body has antigens on the surface, and antigens are proteins that we find on the surface of the cell. And every cell in your body has a unique marker protein on it that nobody else in the world theoretically has. And so that's what marks those cells as your cells. And that's what your white blood cells, your immune system, are going around looking for. Your immune system doesn't know what a bacteria is. It doesn't know what a virus is. It just knows it doesn't have your marker protein on it. So if something shows up that doesn't have your marker protein on it, the leukocytes will go about destroying them. Most of your leukocytes, like it says here, are phagocytotic. Phage means to eat, so they're eating cells. And they might actually engulf them like an amoeba would, or they might secrete digestive enzymes in order to destroy it. Now, unlike your red blood cells should stay in your blood vessels at all times, because the job of your red blood cells, since they're shaped like little baskets and little boats, because remember, structure determines function, the job of them is to circulate your body and carry nutrients and waste products. Well, bad guys, which are called pathogens, aren't always in your bloodstream. They can be, on the surface of your organs, they're crawling around. So therefore, your white blood cells have the ability to leave your blood vessels in order to circulate. And like I mentioned before, these are the cells of your immune system. Now, white blood cells obviously are white. So when you look at them underneath the microscope, they are clear. And as you know, scientists like to stain cells in order to get a better picture of them. Well, when they would stain the blood, the clear cells reacted differently, which immediately let scientists know, okay, that means that there's different chemicals in these cells, and those cells are reacting differently. So therefore, if they have a different structure, they have different functions. And this is how we were able to figure out that there were basically 5 categories of white blood cells. Well, we'll take all 5 types of white blood cells, and you can see them here, what are called monocytes, lymphocytes, neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. And we divide them into 2 main groups. You're what's called an agranular white blood cell, or you're going to be what's called a granular white blood cell. Now, in the case of agranular, that means without spots. So in this picture here, you'll see something called a monocyte or something called a lymphocyte, and those cells are agranular. So when you stain them, you do not see what looks like dots floating around. If you look at the neutrophil, the eosinophil, or the basophils, you'll see what looks like spots. Okay. Well, that's what it means to be agranular. Basically, when the chemicals inside of these cells do not react with the stain, and so you still get this nice clear picture, but the nucleus and the cell themselves do change colors. When we stain these cells, they do turn this really pretty sky blue. And so you can see here with the monocytes and the lymphocytes, the nucleus tends to be a dark purple color, but the cytoplasm still stays this nice, pretty sky blue color, and they're agranular, so that means you don't see things floating around inside the cell. Now, what we have found through time, remember, if I were to take a sample of your blood and study it, just from experience, I would know, on average, how many of each type of white blood cell should show up in your blood. So usually when we go to the doctor, doctors don't really take blood tests. But sometimes some people are so sick that the doctor has to come in and they'll request samples of lab work done. Well, what they're doing is they might be looking for a white blood cell count. And they're looking to see different types of white blood cells. And one of the white blood cells, and over time, if we notice a rise in certain types of white blood cells, that's our clue that what's going on. So in the case of monocytes, monocytes are the largest white blood cells that you can have. And what's very interesting about white blood cells is for some reason their nucleus likes to change shape. As you guys know, the nucleus is where we keep our DNA. And in most cells, the nucleus is a circle. But something about white blood cells, again, structure determines function. Their nucleus likes to form lumps, or their nucleus likes to change shapes. And in the case of monocytes, the nucleus looks like a horseshoe. And these are the largest types of white blood cells that you have. They do turn this pretty blue color. And like I said, in a healthy person, if I were to take a blood sample and do lab work, I would know about how many white blood cells should be showing up in your drop of blood. Well, if you have more white blood cells than normal, then when a large number of monocytes begin to show up in lab work, that over time, doctors have learned that means you probably have a virus attacking your body. And again, experience has told these doctors that you're probably, one of the first things they're going to test you for is, do you have TB, which is tuberculosis? Or do you have hepatitis, which is a liver disease? Or do you have mono, which we're going to talk about later on? But again, if we were to just do lab work on a normal person, we would know about how many monocytes should show up in a drop of blood. But for somebody who's sick, if there's an increase, a spike in these monocytes, then doctors know just through experience and time that your body is trying to fight off a virus. And these are some of the things that they are going to test you for first. And I forgot, if you have the anatomy coloring book, there is a page titled The Cardiovascular System with blood and blood cells. Just depending on what coloring book you have, it's going to be a different page. So, but if you have the anatomy coloring book, you can find that page, and on there you'll see it's listed the 5 different types of white blood cells for you, and it gives you the descriptions, a lot of what I'm talking about in this video. Now, there's also an agranular white blood cell called a lymphocyte, and lymphocytes get their name because they tend to stay in lymph nodes. Lymph nodes are things like our tonsils. They're basically filters that we have in our body, and I will have another video later about the lymph system that you'll be able to view on YouTube. But our lymph nodes are basically water filters. So just like water coming in from the street gets filtered before it comes into your house, water moving through your body will get filtered before it gets added back to our bloodstream. And our lymph nodes are filters. Well, you can change a filter in your house. You know, you can change your air conditioning filter. Back in the day, we had coffee filters we would change. But we can't change the filters in our bodies. So lymphocytes get their name because they tend to live in lymph nodes, and they're phagocytes that basically eat the trash and the bad cells that get filtered out and get trapped inside of our lymph nodes. But these are the smallest type of white blood cell that we have in our body. And they're actually so small that, as you can see in this picture, the nucleus takes up almost the entire cell. And again, in a normal person, if we were to do lab work, we would know on average about how many of these types of cells should show up in our bodies. But if they show up in more number, again, that's a sign that our bodies are trying to fight off a virus of some type. Now, these are both the 2 types of agranulars. So you can remember that the sites go together. Monocyte and lymphocyte are brothers and sister. So you know that they belong together in a group. If you'll notice the other 3, neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. These are the Phil brothers. So they all belong to a group. And they belong to a group that we call granular white blood cells. When we stain these guys, the chemicals that they have inside of them react differently than the chemicals inside of a monocyte or a lymphocyte, and they tend to turn a pink or an orange in color. And they get their name granular because when you look at them underneath the microscope, you will see vesicles floating around in the cytoplasm. So when you look at them, it looks like they have grains of sand inside of them. And in the case of these, there are 3 types, and on average, they're about all the same size. Remember, monocytes are the largest white blood cell you can have. Lymphocytes are the smallest white blood cell you can have. And when mature, these white blood cells are all about the same size. Now the first one here is what's called a neutrophil. Now, if you were to count all the white blood cells in your body, neutrophils make up about 65% of all of your white blood cells. So these are the most common type of white blood cell that you have. And as you can see in this picture, it is a drawing, but you can see that it does have like spots floating around inside of them. And again, you can see how the nucleus, for some reason, takes on this really weird shape, which is a characteristic of our types of white blood cells. Oh, and as you can see here, the nucleus is divided into different lobes. Now, with the neutrophils, again, we know how much we should have these in a normal lab work. But if somebody is sick and the doctor calls for a blood test to be done, and your neutrophils show up in a higher amounts, that is the doctor's clue that you're fighting a bacterial infection. Remember, if monocytes or lymphocytes have an increased number, you have a viral infection. Well, if neutrophils have an increased number, you have a bacterial infection. And that's going to help the doctor figure out the best way to treat you, because viruses and bacteria are treated separately. If you have a bacterial infection, we can give you antibiotics. Antibiotics tend to be fungal-based chemicals that help our bodies destroy bacteria. Bacteria have a cell wall that goes around them. And what antibiotics do is that these are chemicals commonly from fungi that eat holes in the cell walls of the bacteria. So water rushes into the bacteria and the bacteria explodes. And so if you have a viral infection, there's no need for a doctor to prescribe you antibiotics because they're not going to work. So lab work can give the doctor an idea, is this a virus? Is this a bacteria? Now, it's not going to tell the doctor maybe what kind of virus it is or what kind of bacteria that you're fighting off, but at least it helps the doctor figure out a plan of treatment as to, is it a virus, is it a bacteria, what is it that I'm going to do? Now, there is something called banded neutrophils. And when banded neutrophils show up, this is not a good thing. Banded neutrophils are neutrophils that have not yet finished forming. And remember, our white blood cells are made in our bone marrow, and they should stay in our bone marrow until they finish maturing, and then they can go wherever in our body needs to. And banded neutrophils get their name because when you look at them underneath the microscope, they look like they have stripes. Well, these should never show up in our bloodstreams. If these guys start showing up in our bloodstream, that lets us know that our body is fighting a very serious infection. And basically, we are giving weapons to our children, and we're asking our children to go fight the war. So everything our body has done hasn't worked. And so we're throwing in the kitchen sink. Okay. Now, in the case of neutrophils, like I said, they do make up about 65% of all of the white blood cells you have in your body, and they tend to focus on bacteria. And this, we've all had infected sores, or unfortunately, we've all had acne, and we had pus form. Well, what pus is, like in acne, it's a bacterial infection. And most of the time when you have an infected wound, it's bacterial as well. And what pus is basically masses of bacteria-stuffed neutrophils. So these are, when you go to war, there are casualties. And we have to bring those casualties to the surface. And so that's what forms pus. Another type of granular white blood cell is something called an eosinophil. And you can see in this picture, you've got the big white blood cell in the middle, and you can see that the nucleus, again, has changed shape. The other cells around it are our red blood cells. And so it looks like they're hollow because that's the little basket portion. But in the case of an eosinophil, eosinophils only make up about 3% of our white blood cells. So we normally don't have a lot of these. So I could probably take a blood sample and these might not even show up. But when we stain these kind of turn an orange color. And as you can see that the nucleus is kind of a bilobed. And again, we don't know why the nucleus changed shape like this. And there's still a lot of conversation as to what eosinophils are used for. But we do know that they contain digestive enzymes, and they tend to work by exploding open. But like I said, we tend to not have these in large numbers in our blood. But if a blood test is done and we find these in large numbers, doctors have learned that you're probably fighting off an allergic reaction, or a parasitic infection. And again, there's still a lot of conversation as to what these do, but we do know that concentration of eosinophils get larger. So our body has more of these in these situations. And keep in mind what an allergic reaction is. When you have an allergic reaction, your body is kind of overreacting. When you need help, you dial 911. And a dispatcher answers the phone, takes down your information, and usually sends a police officer and the fire department to your house. Well, your cells also have a 911 call. You've all heard of histamine before. Well, histamine is a chemical that's given off by damaged cells. Well, that's what an infection is. When you have a bacterial infection or a viral infection, your cells are damaged in some way. In the case of viruses cause your cells to explode. You can see more about this on the immunity video that I have here on YouTube. But when you have bacteria, you have cells that are being damaged. And so cells will secrete histamine as their 911 call. Now, you always have cells being damaged in your body, so you always have histamine in your blood. So your body has learned that as long as histamine is at a certain level, everything's okay. But when histamine levels begin to spike, that's the sign that, okay, something is wrong. Well, the only time your body should be secreting histamine is if you have cells that are being damaged. An allergic reaction, I always use the example, it's kind of like your body is a little confused or your body might be bored, and something like cat hair or something like pollen or something like peanut oil. These are not pathogens. These are not creatures that can hurt your cells. So in one way, though, your body is doing what it's supposed to. It recognizes that this is not a chemical that's natural to your body, but yet it does not recognize that it's not a virus or bacteria or parasite, something that can actually hurt you. And it causes a group of cells called mast cells to start to create histamine. And the mast cells are like, okay, why am I doing this? Because there's nothing wrong. And like, we don't care, secrete histamine anyway. So your mast cells begin to create histamine, which sets off your immune response. And one of the things that histamine causes us to do is to create more mucus. So that's why when you have an allergy, you get a runny nose. But for some people, their body goes above and beyond, and the mucous membranes in their trachea and their brachial tubes begin to swell. And so that's why some people have life-threatening reactions to allergies. But in a real, honest-to-goodness allergy, we will secrete eosinophils. And it's believed that the eosinophils actually tell the mast cells to turn off so that our body is not creating this unneeded histamine. Now, the last type that we have here is what's called a basophil. And basophils are the rarest type of white blood cell that you have. And in all honesty, they make up less than 1%. It's very possible that you would take drops of blood and look at them underneath the microscope, and you never ever see a basophil show up. That's very, very, very normal. It's believed that basophils are vestigial, meaning we don't know what their purpose is. They seem to have no purpose in our body, but we still have them. So it probably falls under that. It's better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. So at some point in time, these white blood cells did something. And through evolution, maybe we've gotten rid of that bacteria or maybe we've gotten rid of that virus, but our body wants to keep it around just in case that bad guy shows up again. So everybody should have very, 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 very few of these in their bodies. And again, you should be able to take a blood sample and never, ever, ever find any of these. But if a person is sick and a doctor begins to take blood samples and these begin to show up, that is a sign, and the doctor will actually begin to test this person for leukemia, which is what we're going to talk about on the next slide. Now, keep in mind, a disorder is something that tends to be genetic, while a disease is something that's caused by a virus or bacteria. So we're going to look at here are different types of leukocyte disorders. And like I just mentioned, leukemia will fall into this category. By definition, leukemia is what we call cancerous white blood cells, but I don't really like the way that this definition is, because what's actually cancerous, or whatever actually is messed up, are the monocytes in the bone marrow. Remember, white blood cells are made by the bone marrow, and these are what we call germ cells. Germ cells are cells whose only job is to go through mitosis. In the case of leukemia, there is a mutation in the bone marrow. And so therefore, remember, cancer means the cells just keep dividing and keep dividing and keep dividing, and they have lost contact inhibition. So these cells just keep dividing, but they're also creating mutated white blood cells. So these are white blood cells that aren't going to do the job that they're supposed to do. So not only am I wasting energy by I keep making white blood cells, I'm also making the wrong kind of white blood cells. So even though it says cancerous white blood cells, it's actually the bone marrow in most cases that is mutated. That's why people have to have bone marrow transplants, which lead to a whole nother situation. Because remember, your immune system is looking for your marker proteins. Well, when somebody has a bone marrow transplant, they try to get a match. Well, a match is somebody whose marker protein is as close as possible to the person who needs that bone marrow. But remember, not even identical twins sometimes have the same marker proteins. So when you give somebody a bone marrow transplant, you actually eradicate, you destroy their bone marrow. That's why they have to go into quarantine for a short period of time. And then the donor gives bone marrow that's grown and cultured, and then it is inserted back into the patient. And over time, their bone marrow takes over. But now the situation has been raised where this person is making the immune system, but they're making the donor's immune system. So the marker proteins on the white blood cells no longer match the marker proteins on their own cells. So these people do have to continue with immunodeficiency or immune blocking drugs in order to make sure that their new white blood cell, their new immune system, which really isn't theirs, doesn't attack their own cells. Another situation is what's called leukopenia. And leukopenia is where you don't have enough white blood cells. And this is characteristic of AIDS. Now, all of your life you've heard of HIV, the human immunodeficiency virus. And like I mentioned before, in the case of you, when you need help, you dial 911. But when you call 911, you don't talk to the police officer, you don't talk to the fire person, you talk to a dispatcher. Well, we have dispatchers in our bodies, and those dispatchers are what are called helper cells. Well, viruses are specific. Viruses are looking for certain cells. If you think of viruses as having puzzle pieces on their surface, and our cells have puzzle pieces on their surface, the virus has to be able to stick to the cell. So something like hepatitis can only stick to a virus. Influenza, actually, it can only stick to the liver. Influenza can only stick to lung tissue. Well, in the case of HIV, unfortunately, it sticks to these helper cells. So HIV destroys helper cells, which basically would be like us firing all of the dispatchers. So you call 911, but there's nobody there to answer the phone. Well, people who are HIV positive have the virus, but yet they still have enough helper cells to start an immune response. So basically what that means is you might call 911 and it might take an hour for somebody to answer the phone, but eventually somebody will answer the phone. Once you do not have enough helper T cells to start everyday immune responses, at that point in time you're classified as having AIDS. So in that case, it would be like you dialing 911 and nobody ever answers the phone. The opposite of that is leukocytosis. This is where you have too many white blood cells. So again, this is a symptom of leukemia. It can cause your blood to become thick because remember, the white blood cells are supposed to leave your blood vessels and go wherever they're needed. But a lot of times people with leukemia and the mutated white blood cells tend to stay in their bloodstream, which can cause their blood to become too thick. And as you know, that can cause the blood to have a hard time flowing. And then mono is one that you've all heard of. Now, by definition, mono is a benign form of leukemia. So remember, leukemia is when you have mutated bone marrow, so therefore you make mutated white blood cells. So therefore you have a compromised immune system. Well, people with mono mononucleosis is viral. Well, this virus attacks our bone marrow cells, and it causes our bone marrow to make incorrect white blood cells. Well, that's the definition of leukemia. The only difference is it is a virus. So our body will eventually get rid of that virus, and hopefully our bone marrow goes back to making the white blood cells that they're supposed to make. Which then leads us to the third type of cell that we have in our blood. You have your erythrocytes, which are your red blood cells. You have leukocytes, which are your white blood cells. And then you have thrombocytes, which are commonly called your platelets. Now, when you see the term cyte, that makes you think of a round cell. And thrombo is a key word or root word that you're going to see throughout the rest of this video. But thrombocytes are commonly called platelets because these aren't actually full-blown cells. Okay? When you take a plate and drop it on the floor and it breaks into all these pieces, each of these pieces is called a platelet. Okay? Because thrombocytes, or these platelets, are actually bits of cytoplasm from larger cells. So by definition, they're not really a whole cell. So their scientific name is a thrombocyte, but again, when you see cyte, that makes you think of a round cell, when in reality, they're small pieces. Now, these cells called megakaryocytes, mega meaning large, kero meaning nucleus. Megakaryocytes are cells found in our bone marrow. And these are the cells, what I call the mama cells, that will kind of split apart or pinch off in order to form our platelets. And remember, these cells have to know when to do that. So we have a hormone called thrombopoietin. Here's that thrombo again. This is why these guys are called thrombocytes. And anytime you see the root word poietin, like this is where the term poet comes from. Poietin means to create or to make. So thrombopoietin is the hormone that tells these megakaryocytes that they need to pinch off or they need to break up in order to form what we call our platelets. Now, the whole purpose of these is to be used in blood clotting. Okay? The only time you should form a blood clot is when you have damaged a blood vessel. It would be like you having a garden hose and you got a hole poked in it and water starts squirting out through the hole. Well, you guys know we can take duct tape and we can duck it around the garden. We can wrap it around the garden hose in order to stop that flow. Well, think of your blood vessels as a garden hose, and when you cut yourself, you put a hole in your blood vessel, and so blood leaks out. Well, a bruise is where you've cut your blood vessel, but you haven't cut the skin, so the blood's collecting beneath the skin. A scab is a type of blood clot. It's just a blood clot that's on the surface of your skin. So what we're going to do is look at blood clotting, which is a chain reaction. Now, we've talked about positive feedback and negative feedback. And remember, negative feedback, you have two hormones. One hormone turns something on and one hormone turns something else. Well, blood clotting is a classic example of a positive feedback. Remember, positive feedback mechanisms occur under what your body would consider unnormal situations or times of stress. Well, having a hole in your blood vessel is an abnormal situation. And so your body is going to go through a chain reaction using several different hormones in order to create a blood clot. And once that blood clot's in place, then your body will stop this chain reaction and turn off. So, just some facts about when we have damaged blood vessels. Okay. Remember, a scab is a blood clot that forms on the outside of your skin, so it does dry up. Okay. But when you cut yourself, you want to skin your knee. You guys know when you skin your knee or you skin your elbow, you form a scab. Okay. Well, this is because we have jagged edges. If you were to like skin your knee and look at your skin underneath the microscope, it would have all these points and jagged edges to it, which is good because it makes it easier for a blood clot to form. It's like you climbing a mountain. You have places you can put your hands. You have places where you can step, like little ledges you can put your feet, and allows you to crawl up. Okay? Well, these are what are often called rough edges. And this is why, if you were to cut yourself, you would skin your knee or skin your elbow, a scab would form. But you guys all know, like if you cut yourself with a knife or a paper cut, you don't get a scab. Well, think of that as being a sheer ice wall. There's no nooks and crannies for you to hold on to. And the same thing is true for the whole process of blood clotting. The edges are like ice, so there's no places for these fibers we're going to talk about to attach to. So it's very hard to form a clot or a scab. So that's when you give yourself a paper cut, you don't form a scab. Or if you cut yourself with a knife, a lot of times you have to go in and have stitches because since it's like this ice wall, the blood clot can't form. There's no place for it to hold on to. So let's look at how our body forms blood clots. Okay. And again, it's going to be a chain reaction, and you're going to see a lot of different hormone names. Okay. Now, like I mentioned, when cells are damaged, they will call 911, and they use histamine in order to do so. So you have hit the corner of your table really hard, and you've popped a blood vessel under your skin. Or you were outside roller skating, and you fell down and you skinned your knee. Okay. But either way, you have torn tissue. Well, when you tear the tissue, you call for help. Well, your cells dial 911, and your cells secrete a hormone called histamine. Well, like I said, you always have cells that are hurt in your body. So you always have histamine in your blood. And so your body has learned to kind of ignore histamine to a certain level. But when there's a spike of histamine, that will trigger your platelets into action. So your platelets will recognize this chemical, and they will try to find where the histamine is coming from. And so platelets will recognize it and will go to the site that's releasing it. Now, once they find the area, they realize, oh my gosh, there's a hole there. Let me stick my finger in that hole to try and stop the flow of water until I can get a plug there. And so the platelets will cling to the damaged areas, and they will start to secrete a hormone called thromboplastin. And again, we're going to start a chain reaction here. So again, you can see the root word thrombo, so you know that this has something to do with blood clotting. But when the platelets find the hole, it's basically like that old story about the young boy, there was a crack in the dam. So he stuck his finger in that crack in order to keep the hole from getting bigger. Well, that young boy can't stand there forever, but he knows if he pulls his thumb out, water's going to start gushing out again. So the platelets will find that spot and begin this chain reaction in order to basically form the clot or to kind of, replaster the hole that's there. And they're going to secrete a hormone called thromboplastin. Now, you have what are called inactive proteins in your body. Inactive proteins are proteins that are not turned on. These are proteins that are just kind of floating around, and it's like they're sleeping. They have to be turned on. But we always have them in our bodies, again, because it's better to have them and not need them than to need them and not have them. We don't want to have a situation where our body goes, oh my gosh, I need this protein. Can somebody make the time to make it? We don't have time for that. We need that protein there. So in our blood, we have this inactive protein called prothrombin. So pro meaning before, and it's turned off. So it's like having a light switch that's turned off. And it's just floating around in our bodies, and something has to come in and turn it on. So this is what's going to start that chain reaction. When thromboplastin reaches a certain level, that will mix with the prothrombin in our blood, and it's like flipping a light switch. And that's going to cause a chemical reaction which changes the shape of this protein. These are proteins. So remember, you can change the shape and change their job. So think of prothrombin as just like a straw. And then when it comes in contact with thromboplastin, it all of a sudden curls up. Well, if you change the structure, you're going to change its job. So thromboplastin will turn prothrombin on, like flicking a light switch. It basically will change the shape of that protein, and that protein is now going to have another job. Well, if it has a different job, we have to give it a different name. So thromboplastin will get secreted. It will mix with prothrombin, and it will cause prothrombin to change shape, and it'll make a hormone called thrombin. So now you can see that thrombocytes, which are platelets, this whole pattern of thrombs. Oh, we still haven't formed a blood clot yet. You have another inactive protein in your body called fibrinogen. And you can see from the name that fibrinogen is going to have something to do with fibers. And you can see in this picture here, all these fibers. Well, we have to form a spider web. And you know that spider webs are sticky and things get trapped in the spider web. So over this hole that's been formed in our blood vessel, we need to form a net, and we need to make a sticky net. And so the thrombin, but we don't need sticky nets just floating around our bloodstream all the time. We only need to have this sticky net formed when we have a hole. So that's why we have this chain reaction. Well, thrombin will react with fibrinogen to make something called fibrin. And it's just like all of a sudden having cotton candy just shoot out, and all these fibers start to form, as you can see in this picture. And these fibers are sticky, and they'll begin to weave over the hole. And as the blood is passing by, some red blood cells get stuck in the spider web. So eventually there's enough red blood cells that are stuck that I have plugged that hole. And you've all had a scab before, and that's what a scab is. And you've all picked a scab before. And if you ever looked at a scab, it looks like it has fibers on the edges. Well, you're seeing these fibers here. So like a web, the fibers are sticky, and they're going to trap your red blood cells as they pass by. And that will harden and form a clot or a scab. And that's what's called a thrombus. So you can see thrombocyte, prothrombin, thrombopoietin, all these have to do with blood clots. Now remember, the only time you should form a blood clot is when you actually have damaged a blood vessel. So a good blood clot is called a thrombus. But sometimes people can have buildup inside of their blood vessels, things like cholesterol or plaque. And it tricks the platelets into thinking that you've cut the blood vessels. Because remember, the inside of the blood vessel should be nice and smooth. But if you start to have a buildup, it forms jagged edges, and it can actually trick the platelets into thinking of a blood clot. And so they begin to do this process even though there's nothing wrong with your blood vessel. And that can cause what's called an embolus. E-M-B-O-L-U-S. An embolus is a blood clot you don't want to have, okay? Because you have healthy blood vessels, and it can actually plug those blood vessels and cause